Here we go.
Awesome. So it is July 23rd. This is the Crossplane community meeting. I'm sitting in for Jared today. My name is Daniel. So got a pretty good number of community members here today, it looks like. So welcome to everyone. And we'll just go through, per usual, kind of what we have set up for the project and milestone for version 0.3. And we've got a couple of community topics and PRs here to go through. A lot of them may be kind of longer discussions, so we'll try and keep it brief and then reserve other time if we need to get into deeper technical conversation on it. And then if there's anything that's not listed here, I'll bring up some time at the end to kind of mention anything that we don't have here. So going ahead and looking at the 0.3 project, basically right now we're looking at a lot of sort of restructuring of the project right now. So version 0.3 kind of started with a technical debt prioritization effort, and that led to some design discussions that we've been having on various pull requests and such, and that'll be reflected. But there's a lot of kind of interdependency on some of these things. So I'll start by saying some of the things that have been implemented and then some of the things that have dependencies on each other. So starting out, default resource classes, these have been implemented. So basically for the generic resource class kind that they have right now, you can specify it as default for a given claim kind. And if you leave out the class reference for the claim, it will default to the resource class that specified it as the default for that claim. So this is functional right now. It's been merged. That being said, there's probably going to be some updates to this because of a desire to move to strongly typed resource classes. So this is a design document that's out right now. You can feel free to look at. It's linked in the community meeting docs here, down here. But essentially what it's proposing is moving to strongly typed resource classes. So if we looked here, and this document's a little bit out of date at this point with some of the reviews that have been going on. But essentially what we want to do is move from all resource classes being of kind resource class to being more specific. So something like RDS instance class. So it would be strongly typed one-to-one with the managed resource kinds. So that would be like an AWS RDS instance or a Google Cloud SQL instance. The classes would be strongly typed in that manner. However, there's some issues that come up with trying to default with that because you don't know what to watch for anymore, when before we were watching for just the resource class kind. Now there's an arbitrary number of kinds that we could need to watch for. So there's some discussion here that Nick's provided some really valuable feedback. And essentially the main thing that we're looking at here is in moving to these strongly typed resource classes where there could be an arbitrary number of kinds of resource class, how do we do that defaulting? So the initial proposal was that we create a new custom resource called a defaulter, or we could, that name is still up for debate, but that was just the proposal, where essentially you specify a resource class that should serve as default for a given claim kind. So a claim kind would be the abstract type, like a MySQL instance. The resource class would be an RDS instance or something of that nature. And you basically just tie those things together so it knows to look for that kind for the given claim kind. So once again, looking at this, we can see a little bit what this looks like. So the defaulter would say something like, and this would be changed to kind here. So it would say something like RDS instance class name and namespace for a given RDS instance class had been created. And then it would specify what it's default for. So a MySQL instance would default to this RDS instance class, standard MySQL and Crossplane system. So that was the initial proposal. Nick kind of countered with another proposal of using mutating webhooks. So essentially, in that proposal, you would need to create a different mutating webhook for each claimed class tuple, which he specifies here. And it would say basically, apply this default if this mutating webhook configuration has been registered, and then you have a mutating webhook controller that would basically make sure that there's only one mutating webhook for a given claim kind. So anyway, there's a lot of background there. We don't want to get too deep into that right now. We can reserve some time at the end if needed, but this is kind of the discussion that's happening here. There's a fair amount of content and some links to other things, so feel free to look into that.
Yeah, then I want to ask about the mutating webhook configuration. So you said like we need one for each of them,
right?
So some time ago I implemented an admission webhook, not the mutating one, but I think mutating is also the similar. So as far as I remember, it's like you build a server and you create a webhook configuration and specify like what types that will go through that server. And like in one configuration, we can statically specify like, hey, these types will go into that. And then in that server, we can, you know, do the casting and like decision-making logic, something to look in.
Right, for sure. So that's how I understand it as well. The complexity kind of arises in the fact that you could potentially have an arbitrary number of types that could serve as default. So every time you installed a new provider that could provide new resource classes that could serve as default for a claim kind, you'd have to be able to add a new webhook and register that, have the ability to register that, because the core Crossplane implementation isn't going to be aware at the outset of all the possible resource classes that are available.
I got you. Or we would require everyone to implement their own mutating webhook server.
Right, and that's pretty in line with, and I've linked to here, you can actually just specify that in KubeBuilder as we kind of do for implementing our CRDs. So you can look through those links there, or anyone can, especially this one right here. It kind of shows how you can implement a mutating webhook and install that. But all of that kind of goes back to this overarching discussion around this kind of monorepo versus multi-repo topic. So essentially, there's been question throughout the entire Crossplane project about, you know, what should be part of a core Crossplane implementation and what should be separate and installed as an extension or a stack. And so a lot of these things are dependent on whether they're, you know, core to Crossplane or an extension. So for instance, the default resource classes, you know, that the reason why we'd have to have that sort of ability to support an arbitrary number of default resource classes is because there's the ability to install resource classes at any point in an arbitrary number of them. So this discussion here affects a lot of different things. And one of the most pertinent to that discussion is Nick's PR around the shared managed resource reconciler. So if we want to take a look at that. And this is a pattern that we've kind of been implementing across different types of controllers. So we've already implemented this with a claim controller and the current implementation of the default class controllers, where essentially you have different controllers for each of these different resources, but they share a common reconciler pattern. So you implement something like, for instance, in this managed resource reconciler, observe, create, update, and finalize. And then the shared reconciler calls these method in the same succession. So you have the same steps, but the implementation of the actual methods are left up to the creator of that managed resources kind or controller. So this is something that also has quite a bit of feedback on it. And I know, Muvafiq, that you've kind of been co-authoring sort of with Nick here. So is there anything that you wanted to kind of talk about in relation to this PR here?
Yeah, I mean, like pretty much as you summed up. I mean, the goal for this PR is that, one, to make it easy for the collaborators to implement their own controllers. And second is that we actually want to keep the reconciled pattern stable, so that we know what's happening around, and then people would go and use that stuff. But also, it's not an API design, so we don't really limit anyone. It's just like a pattern. So yeah, I think after 1 or 2 rounds, that will be ready. And depending on the monorepo, multi-repo, in case of multi-repo, we will probably refactor the existing ones, the controllers. But if you go with monorepo, I think we would just refactor a few of them and then later on visit the other ones.
Absolutely. I think that was a really good summary. Thank you for that. I think one thing you said that was really important about this PR here is, in this general pattern, is that we provide a standard way to implement controllers, but it's not restricting in any way, right? Like you said. So if there's still kind of custom functionality that needs to be implemented for a various, set of infrastructure resources, we don't prohibit that from happening. We simply say this is a standard pattern, and we really increase the velocity of infrastructure stack developers so that they're able to implement things a lot more quickly if they're following that kind of standard pattern, which should be, as Nick says here, somewhere in the PR for, around 80% of managed controllers. This will probably be the pattern that it's followed. And obviously that could evolve over time. But I think another good thing you brought up is that, the effort after implementing this will kind of be different based on how we go about splitting the repository into multiple repositories, which I think is sort of the pattern that we're settling on here. So I think the following things to, once this becomes mergeable and gets implemented, is probably to split out those repositories and then implement individually in each of those, which shouldn't be too different from implementing them within this single repo as well.
So I have a question, Dan. So you're saying the reason for multiple repositories is just because you want to give the possibility of writing extensions, not necessarily as default controllers. But then why do you want to have a different repository? Wouldn't that be possible to just have them in the same repository?
So right now, for instance, we have GCP, AWS, Azure all in this repository. I think the real reason of wanting to separate them into different repositories is that it kind of isolates their life cycle, right? So there may be an update, let's say, that needs to happen to GCP, or they may be moving at a different pace than the AWS project. And we kind of want that life cycle and workflow separate from the core Crossplane implementation. And then as we continue to add more and more providers, it's also an opportunity to say, hey, this is an established pattern of how a large cloud provider sort of implements these controllers, and it allows for a consistent way and a good reference point for implementing your own infrastructure stack if it is, a smaller set of resources or something like that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I haven't worked with GitHub repositories before, but I do remember just one thing that comes to mind is when you have multiple repositories, usually there are also a lot of overhead work that you have to do compared to having just one single repositories and then having multiple artifacts coming off of that. But I'm fine. I was just I think it makes sense. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely think so. And just to be clear, so the other repositories would be running as like separate binaries that are installed into Crossplane. But yeah, there would definitely be some orchestration involved in kind of like maintaining all of those repositories. But I think that the goal eventually is for us to bring more people in and have those be opportunities for people to own those projects and infrastructure stacks. And kind of grow the community in that way. So I think that would be a great opportunity as well. Did anyone else have questions or comments on this pattern of sort of a shared reconciler that this would be the third time we've kind of implemented this pattern into Crossplane, or questions or comments around the splitting into multiple repositories and really just keeping like claims, the abstract portable kinds in the core, and every other specific kind that's specific to any type of infrastructure implementation in separate repositories.
I have a follow-up question on that. And again, this is more kind of like me understanding how things are, not necessarily giving you the directions. So if we're using multiple repositories, do we have any common code that we have to replicate over multiple repositories, or are there any thoughts of like them using a shared repository or like a package to be able to write extensions?
Absolutely. So that's a good point, and that's very pertinent to this actual PR right here. So this shared resource reconciler, and it may be useful, and I'll try not to spend too much time on this because it is the community meeting, so I don't want to get too deep technically in a single issue. But if you look in here, if we look in the resource package, we have these kind of shared reconcilers here. So let's see. If we look here, this is a reconciler that is shared among claims. It's the claim reconciler. So right now, currently, this claim reconciler is implemented in various controllers for, let's say, like an AWS bucket. It's calling the resource new claim reconciler here. So the other repositories could follow that same pattern, right, and import that resource package that's currently available, and they could do the same for manage resources and default classes and that sort of thing.
Awesome, makes sense.
Cool. Anyone else have any pressing questions or comments on that topic?
I'll throw in a comment. I also think that it helps when things are all split out compared to when everything is in a mono repo where we only have these golden providers available, because the developers will tend to take shortcuts that are to the benefit of those internal providers. And when you're coding everything as an external provider, you can't take those shortcuts, and so then everybody gets is working on the same field. I know with providers I've worked in the past, I've encountered limitations that were because I was using external, sort of like an external plugin system as opposed to the internal system. So by getting that out of the way early, I think it'll benefit the community.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. So the next topic we have here is this one pager around resource usage that Nick has been working on here. This is pretty extensive, and it has a lot of sort of touch points in other areas that we've already discussed. So looks like, Marcus, you've given some feedback here. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of different things in here that affect things like, reclaim policies, even have touch points in the splitting between repositories, and things like that. Did anyone want to bring up any specific points here? Because it is a bit of a large effort. Marcus, did you have anything in particular?
No.
Okay.
Mention anything on this one. Like you said, it's huge.
Right, absolutely. So I think in terms of looking at this as a sort of constructive document for us to pull things from, it might be useful to break it down further. And I'm not sure that's something we should necessarily do in this meeting. But essentially, a lot of the discussion in here is about isolation of resources, and also about things like connection details and secrets and that sort of thing. And they're all separated here. So I think that the best course of action would be to, if you're interested in this, if you're on this call, to kind of look through here and maybe pick out a certain area, where you see a particular point that you want to kind of contribute to. So resource usage is one, resource secrets is another. And then there's kind of some questions in here about what needs to be done and what things are still open-ended. So I think this will continue to evolve over time, but in terms of tangible specific work that goes towards it, there isn't really a lot defined at this point. But if anyone on the call wanted to bring up any specific points, please feel free to go ahead and do so now. All right. So we'll leave that one to be investigated further. And we already talked here about kind of the strongly typed resource classes one pager. That was what I brought up earlier. So it's kind of right now, it looks like it's a discussion between sort of that new custom resource, the defaulter, or the mutating webhooks. So if you want to contribute to that conversation, hop over to that pull request and jump in on me and Nick's conversation there. I just wanted to also point out some time here for anyone who's been kind of working on the Stacks effort, which is the rebranding, if you will, of the extensions, what have previously been called extensions. So you can see here, Marcus is actually going about and doing some renaming there in the design doc. Is there any particular topics within the Stacks realm that wanted to be brought up? I know we had talked a little bit also on an issue I raised the other day about potential tools. So something like cross control, which would be a proposal for a cube control plugin. And so if anyone on the Stacks team wanted to kind of bring up anything, that would be a good time.
Yeah, I'll go over some of the things that we're considering now. So you mentioned renaming stacks, and in part that's because they're not strictly extensions to Crossplane, that they can, as we've seen with the GitLab application, we've seen that stacks can also install applications. So there's some thinking right now about whether or not infrastructure stack should be separated from application stacks, along with the security ramifications that go with that on either side. There's some thoughts about what cluster scoping versus name scoping versus namespace scoping of the stacks themselves. There's some thinking around one of the primary components of what stacks is, which is to resolve these packages or the dependencies. So if we're installing GitLab and GitLab requires a GCP provider, then it needs to know to figure that out and get that package installed also. Especially this also comes into light when we're talking about splitting Crossplane up by provider. There are additional lifecycle management issues to consider. So what happens when versions of a stack, when you want to upgrade a stack, or when for whatever reason there may be two instances of the same stack, whether it's an infrastructure stack or whether it's a application stack that may need to coexist in the same space, whether that's in a target cluster or whether that's in the hosting cluster where you're running your Crossplane. So there are a lot of issues that we've kind of dug up in the last few weeks that I can't say that all of them exist as issues in the repository right now, but we're definitely intent to do that through some design docs and raising issues along the way over the next few weeks. There are some other points that could be made about this. I don't know if Dan Suskin or Phil, if you guys want to chime in on anything else related to that.
Yeah, I can chime in. Like Marcus was saying at the end, we're still pretty early in the life cycle of the Stacks project. I would think of it as we're just starting to spin up our efforts on this. So it'll definitely evolve over the next few weeks, like Marcus was saying. And we're definitely interested in hearing any input that anyone has on what they would like to see or what would be useful.
Yeah, definitely. So, looking for feedback, and I don't know if everybody's in the community Slack, but if you haven't joined, it's a great place to have, kind of like informal conversations around a lot of these topics. And so we're hanging out in there on a fairly regular basis. So it'd be great to see y'all in there if you're interested in, kind of diving in a little deeper.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil and Daniel and Marcus. All right. So I think that covers the main topics for today. I think as far as action items, it is a little bit hazy right now in terms of what the resulting things will be from things like resource isolation. So there's still discussions that will need to go on for that. But I would encourage anyone on the call to sort of start to engage with that idea of what it looks like to further separate providers and infrastructure components into different repositories and thus install them as extensions rather than being, or as stacks rather than being core to Crossplane. So if there's nothing else that needs to be covered or needs to be discussed in the call for this week, I'd like to give just a few minutes here for anyone who's new to the call, new to the community. If you'd like to have the opportunity to introduce yourself, we'd be more than happy to give you that opportunity. And if there's a specific area that you're interested in or would like to get involved with or have certain questions answered, then please feel free to speak up and let us know what you're interested in.
I'll just introduce myself. My name is Chuck Piercy. I work at Juniper Networks, and I'm just learning at the moment.
Awesome. Welcome, Chuck.
I'll go next. My name is Javad. I joined Upbound yesterday and currently ramping up on Crossplane. And then my first task is to figure out the integration tests for deploying Crossplane. And I'm very excited about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Javad.
I'm Michele Mastrogiovanni from Rome. I'm learning too. I meet Crossplane at KubeCon Barcelona. I'm curious and I'm starting to understand what you are doing, guys.
Awesome. We really appreciate you joining.
Hey, just follow up on the learning comment. Is there a kind of a vision doc, like, roll this out to 1.0, what the demo looks like? Kind of that level?
Absolutely. So there's a number of places that I would encourage you to look for that. So first of all, we have a brief overview here in the repository and the README, but the specific thing you want to look at in terms of a wide spanning architecture overview would be this linked architecture document here. And it is kind of the original kind of outlook on what Crossplane should be able to achieve and that sort of thing. So it's a pretty extensive document that looks at sort of this separation of concern with claims and classes and resources, and also gives a little bit of background on controllers and resource lifecycle and that sort of thing. I don't know that all of this is 100% concurrent with what we are currently doing, but it should give a great overview of the intended mission of the project.
It's great.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
Chuck, we're actually planning a pretty extensive update to this document. Yeah, it's a good place to start. But we're also going to be, there's a lot of lessons learned since last December that are going to be factored into this.
Is there a working group on the doc?
Not right now. It's fairly ad hoc. You're more than welcome to join if you'd like to contribute.
Yeah, right. Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. I really appreciate that, Chuck. Also, just another thing here is we have the Crossplane website, which you can kind of see documentation evolve with versions that are released, as well as whatever is current in the repository. So that's another place to look. And this has information about getting started and that sort of thing. And the last place I just wanted to bring up is we have some examples here in the cluster directory where you can kind of go through and try a number of different areas of functionality, including some of the GitLab deployment, which has kind of been our flagship demo, as well as WordPress here. So those things will continue to evolve with changes that happen in the repository, so they'll remain compatible. Yeah, just as far as any questions you have or anything like that to Chuck or to anyone else on this call, please always feel free to reach out in the Slack, and we'll do whatever we can to get anything answered for you.
I'd also point out that design directory right there. That's been so important to me in figuring out how Crossplane works. Whenever a new design comes up, it goes through the pull request process and goes through several iterations. And then after that, the docs themselves tend to get updated as well as the project has evolved. Absolutely.
Great call out, Marcus. One thing I'd say here is it's important to look and see what the status of each of these documents is. So for instance, this resource reclaim policy, this is a draft. It has been merged into the repository, but it has sort of a workflow proposal here that doesn't necessarily mean it's been implemented. It's just kind of something that was we came to agreement on in a design document. So these are more about discussion around technical implementation of things. They're a great place to learn, as Marcus said, but don't take whatever they say to be the truth about how Crossplane currently functions necessarily. We do try to call out in each of these when we're talking about this is what we currently do, this is a proposal for the future, but just be mindful of that for sure in those. All right, did anyone else want to introduce themselves? If not, then we can call it a meeting. All right, well, thank you to everyone who joined. Please feel free to join us on Slack or in any other communication channel, or raise an issue here on GitHub. We're always more than happy to discuss anything. So everyone have a great week.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Feel good, Dan.
Yeah, this is all recorded, right?
Yes.